Hey guys, Attorney Lee Dundas here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today, along with the educators and school districts and parents, about children and their risk of death from COVID and the changes that schools are starting to contemplate making in the fall of 2020. First of all, your child's risk of dying from COVID is really, really low. The fatality rate in the US for children is so low that kids are actually at a higher risk of death from traveling to school than from catching COVID at school and dying. In fact, the risk is so low that my calculator cannot do the math. There's so many zeros behind the decimal point. And recently, a Bloomberg article quoted the CDC as stating that, and I quote, "The COVID-19 fatality rate in the US for anyone younger than 19 is so low, it is calculated at 0.00%. So according to the CDC, your child's risk of dying from COVID is zero. This is what we also know. Your child is not going to catch COVID at school and become the dreaded silent but deadly transmitter of the disease who brings it home to grandma and kills grandma. Right now, your child, this is another direct quote, "No child is known to have passed COVID-19 to adults," a global study finds. The World Health Organization actually performed contact tracing and found exactly 0 children had passed the disease onward. This is pretty much the same for adults, by the way. In case you didn't catch it, at the end of May, a study came out that showed an adult who was COVID positive but had no symptoms was exposed to almost 500 other people. 0 of them caught the disease. And then this last Monday, the World Health Organization came out and said they are following, and this is another quote, they are following contacts and they are not finding secondary transmission onward. So secondary transmission from a COVID positive patient who doesn't know he or she has it is pretty much non-existent. So what we know at this point in time is your kid's not going to die from COVID. They're also not going to catch COVID, bring it home to grandma, and kill grandma. And accordingly, there's really no reason to make any sort of changes to school protocols, particularly those involving social distancing. But I actually want to talk a little bit about social distancing right now, because social distancing is actually a technique that might be causing more harm to our children than that which it seeks to avoid. Social distancing is a euphemism for social isolation. It was a technique that was developed about 70 years ago by the CIA, and they found it was really, really good at breaking down enemies of state. It creates depression, poor sleep quality, impaired executive function, accelerated cognitive decline, poor cardiovascular function, and impaired immunity. All of those are things I think we can agree we don't want anybody to experience, not least our own children. It doubles your risk of death if you're Black. It almost doubles your risk of death if you're white. And the harm that you get from enacting social distancing and social isolation on somebody is the same as if they were very, very obese. Moreover, it destroys the part of the brain that is actually responsible for learning in our children and ourselves, which is known as the ventral striatum. Medically speaking, what recent studies have shown is it is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day and being an alcoholic. So put simply, we'd be better off lobotomizing our children, handing them a pack of cigarettes and a fifth of whiskey, and then sending them into homeroom than we will be by socially distancing them this fall. I want to actually go back now to the sordid beginnings of how this social distance, social isolation technique was developed by the CIA. In 1951, the CIA held a secret meeting at the Ritz-Carlton in Canada, and it was a meeting with doctors present who had ties, and I quote, to the US, UK, and Canadian military forces. The work at that meeting and subsequent meetings led the CIA to realize that social distancing and isolation techniques were, I quote, "the ideal way of breaking down a prisoner," and another quote, "as effective at destroying the brain function of the prisoner as if the prisoner were beaten, starved, or deprived of sleep." Senator John McCain, who spent over 5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam and had all of his arm and leg bones broken multiple times, and who was also by turn subjected to multiple rounds of social distancing from his fellow POWs, had this to say about social distancing and physical torture. This is what he said about social distancing. "It's an awful thing. It crushes your spirit more effectively than any other form of mistreatment." 150 naval aviators who were also held as POWs in Vietnam came home from the war and echoed what John McCain had said. They said, and I quote, "it was as torturous and agonizing as any physical abuse they suffered, to be separated from their fellow American GIs." The UN Mandela rules actually now prohibit the use of more than 15 days or 2 weeks of social distancing and isolation, classifying it as cruel and inhumane treatment and basically a war crime. So now that we know that there is zero reason to make any changes to our school children, since they're not at risk at all, there's zero risk of them dying from the disease, and they're not going to bring the disease home to grandma. And we know that social distancing is a wartime technique that the CIA uses to break down enemies of state. I want to look briefly at where this 6-foot rule came from, because it seems sort of, magical, right, in the time of COVID. So it turns out that the 6-foot rule came from England, where a lead researcher recently came out in the press and admitted that, quote, officials had told him they did not think the British population would understand what 1 meter or 3 feet was. And, quote, we could not trust the British people to observe it, so we doubled it to be on the safe side. He went on to state, and I quote again, the 2-meter rule was conjured up out of nowhere. And he concluded by referring to it as a, quote, rule of thumb rather than a scientifically proven measure. Casting even more doubt on the lack of science underlying the 6-foot rule is a recent study in which researchers found, and again I quote, that preventive social distancing can increase the final epidemic size at the population level and thus have negative effects for the community at large. You heard me right. Preventive social distancing can make the epidemic worse and increase the size of it. But here's the real problem, folks, in terms of the educational issue here. If we do a 6-foot rule of distance for our school children, at least in California, versus 3 feet or something less than that, we simply cannot fit all of the California school kids into their classrooms at the same time and maintain that 6 feet of distance. So what the educational system in our state is going to have to do is they're going to have to toggle it. 1 day at school, 1 day at home. Or 3.5 hours at school, 3.5 hours each day at home, and do some sort of a hybrid remote learning model. And here is the problem with that. Each summer, kids lose 1 month of the education they gained during that year. It is known the world over by educators everywhere as the summer backslide. But for lower socioeconomic children and children of color, that effect can be magnified. So by 5th grade, by about age 10 or 11, those children, the poor children, the lower socioeconomic children, children of color, can be 2 to 3 years behind their age peers due to this effect. Right now, California has almost 10 million children in this state. Only 1/4 of them are Caucasian. About 75% are children of color and minorities, and almost half of the kids in our state, 43%, are poor or, quote, very, very poor. So this is what we know. Remote learning doesn't work well for anybody, but it really, really works badly for these kids who often only have one parent in the household, and that parent is not in the house during the daytime because they're outside the house earning the bread and bringing home the bacon. They don't have enough computers. They don't have enough internet connections. They don't have enough laptops. They often have multiple siblings in different schools. And for those children, remote learning doesn't work. So basically for the 40 to 75% of California's youth who are either minority or very poor, a hybrid model is going to be catastrophic. The California Constitution guarantees children in our state a right to education. Not just 26% of children in our state who aren't poor and who are Caucasian, but every child in this state has a right to a good education. Go tell the California State Department of Education and Tony Thurmond, our state superintendent of schools, no social distancing, no 6-foot bubble of space around school children, and no remote learning. It unfairly disadvantages minority children and those in lower socioeconomic brackets, and it will put them so far behind their classmates, they will never make up that gap or recover. Social distancing is a CIA protocol used to break down enemies of state. It has zero place in the classroom or being used against our children.